Welcome, everyone, as you're coming in. Sorry to be starting a tiny bit late. It's great that you're all here. And it's wonderful that our guest, Nell Bernstein, is here. Nell is directing advocate for communications at the Youth Law Center and the author of Burning Down the House, winner of the American Bar Association's Silver Gavel Award, and All Alone in the World, a Newsweek book of the week. And In Our Future, We Are Free, the book that we are here to discuss today, all published by the New Press. Nell Bernstein is a former Soros Justice Media Fellow, a McDowell Fellow, and a winner of a White House Champion of Change Award. Her articles have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Glamour, Salon, Mother Jones, and other publications. Nell Bernstein, welcome to the Roots Action Education Fund Book Club of the month.
I'm so glad to be here.
I am so glad you're here, and I'm so glad to have read a success story. I can't even think of another success story in recent days or weeks or months. There's a lot of trends that are worsening, and this one seems to be getting better. What is the basic story?
Well, I will agree with you. I'm astonished to find myself telling a hopeful story in 2026. But it is a really hopeful story. I've been writing about youth incarceration for a couple of decades now. And over the course of those 2 decades, 25 years, youth incarceration has dropped by more than 70%. And it's happened incrementally across the country. So I don't think people are aware of it, especially because the news still covers youth crime as if it were, you know, something that was going to hit you every time you crossed the street. The other thing that's happened is that 2/3 of the youth prisons in this country have closed their doors. And it's really hard to open a closed institution. And, youth crime has dropped by roughly the same amount and is now at its lowest level since we began keeping track. So these are all good news trends that you really just wouldn't know about from reading the newspaper.
You really wouldn't. If it bleeds, it leads. But there's not a simple answer, I think, to this question. Which comes first, the reduction in incarceration or the reduction in crime? Because you mentioned both of them in that order.
Well, there's not a clear one size fits all cause and effect, but there is significant evidence at the state and local level that jurisdictions that dialed back the toughest laws, the laws that were sending teenagers to prison for the rest of their lives as adults, jurisdictions that began to implement diversion for lower level offenses. In other words, jurisdictions that moved away from the tough on kids approach that was popular in the 90s saw a drop in youth crime. So there's pretty strong evidence
Yeah.
that what we were doing was not only not stopping youth crime, it was exacerbating it. And you still see that at a regional level.
I'm asking all the questions here, but I want everyone to put their questions in the chat, and I will ask them. So as questions come to mind from the book or from our conversation, put them in the chat, and I will ask them for you. Nell, are people learning that lesson? Is that helping to continue this trend that people in places of power are actually learning that cause and effect you just described?
I mean, honestly, I'm going to say yes and no, but mostly yes. Uh, the way that this movement happened is multifaceted. It involved all kinds of people taking all kinds of approaches, whether that's young people and families telling their own personal stories of the horrors that they endured while incarcerated, or think tanks putting out reports, offering up evidence that if you treat kids like kids, give them something to do, divert them from the court system, they're much less likely to offend. So it wasn't only the rational argument that prevailed. You mean if only we operated that way, right?
Yeah.
But I do think that when one jurisdiction does something and has success, another may follow. Just as when one jurisdiction starts trying a bunch of kids as adults and throwing away the key, another follows. So I do think a bit of a virtuous cycle uh, has been triggered. That said, there is some backsliding right now since the pandemic towards trying kids as adults and reverting to harsher penalties.
Oh, I hope not. There were virtuous cycles described through the account in the book where alternative sentences and alternative services and sentencings could create empty beds in particular prisons. And then the empty beds could raise the financial cost of keeping the other beds filled, and then requiring that children be treated in compliance with laws rather than simply, warehoused and abused became easier, and the fiscally responsible but who cares about this policy one way or the other politicians could be brought on board. Was there a bank shot sort of strategy to this campaign?
A bank shot strategy.
Like a two-part strategy. You get some beds empty, and then you tell them it's costing you more to keep some
Yes.
of the beds full. So you got to get rid of the rest of the incarcerated kids.
Yes. At what point that became an intentional strategy, I'm not sure, but I've documented the closure of many institutions, and I have never seen a full prison close, right? In every instance, if only you could hold a protest and say, shut this down, and they'd find something to do with the 1,000 kids they had in this monolithic dungeon. That's not the way it happens. I sort of envision advocates, attorneys, a lot of family activists, all kinds of people pulling kids over the wall one by one
Yeah.
until you reach a kind of a tipping point where the per capita cost of incarcerating a kid becomes too high for the public to bear. And also, it's a lot more politically safe for a politician to say we shouldn't be spending $1 million a year to lock up a 12-year-old than for a politician to say, I know this kid robbed someone, but they deserve a second chance. So it allowed politicians to make a fiscal rather than a moral argument, even if the people who were really doing the movement work, of course, were acting from principle.
Yeah. Um, and these, I mean, this is a success story in a moment without many, but this is actually a story of decades and of people working on this longer than the past couple decades, right? There was a time when this did not look like a success and people were willing to try to get it rolling, right?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that I am now the directing advocate for communications at the Youth Law Center, which is headed towards its 50th anniversary. And I work mostly remotely, but I was in our office the other day and I saw a poster um, from, oh God, I think it was the 1970s when the Youth Law Center was advocating to get the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act passed. And that act, two of the main things it did was make it illegal to house children and adults in the same facility, and end the practice of incarcerating status offenders. In other words, truants, kids who wouldn't have be people who wouldn't have been violating the law had they been adults. Um, and what did the poster? The poster had a picture of kind of a scary guy, a bunch of tattoos, and the slogan, meet your new roommate. Well, a lot of bad things are still happening, but I had to be reminded that that doesn't happen anymore. And it's taken for granted. So yeah, this is movement building. This is the work of decades and of generations.
But did that result, however, in standalone youth prisons because the youth couldn't be in the adult
No,
prisons?
no. At that point, we had both.
There already were both.
Yeah,
Yeah. Um,
yeah. It had mostly to do with kids who were charged as adults, uh, not being held in adult jails prior to their 18th birthday.
the the book has just phenomenal good news, but then notes as well that even after all this success and two-thirds of them are closed, the US still has the highest youth incarceration rate on the planet, which means that 20 years ago, the difference between the US and the rest of the planet was extremely dramatic, right?
Yeah, and the other thing that where the US is an outlier and that has not changed substantially despite decades of activism is conditions. So we have a lot fewer kids in youth prisons, but the ones who are inside are still subjected to beatings, to solitary confinement, which is considered torture by international standards, to guards doing things like, they'll offer somebody in some southern state, it was a honey bun, some treat or snack to beat up a kid they don't like, you know, really high levels of sexual abuse as well as physical abuse. So to me, the fact that we've been able to make so much progress on youth decarceration, but we have not been able to create institutions where children aren't abused, tells us something really important about the nature of a locked institution with the kind of power differential that you have in a youth prison. And what it tells us is that abuse is inevitable. It's intrinsic to the structure.
And that maybe we need to keep working for that cultural shift where people care about the morality of the issue and not just the finances.
Yeah, I mean, yes, but in a number of states that have closed their large state-run youth prisons have created smaller facilities that are, you're not in a cell, you're in a room, they're more home-like. But but I don't have a lot of hope for the more humane prison. Um,
No, no, I wasn't suggesting that such a thing
okay. Yeah.
exists in the world or ever
Yeah.
has. Obviously, there are degrees, but I was suggesting the morality of abolishing the things.
Yeah.
Um, so I read this book looking for lessons, for if we can do this with youth prisons, how might one do this with wars or police or whatever else? And um, tell me if I got any of them right. One lesson that I seemed to see in the book was that youth incarceration depended on a lot of secrecy and a lot of lies. And once the tide began to turn, at least in a locality or a state, there were there were videos and reports and shameless testimony about horrible things that could shock people once people were ready to be shocked with them.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I often say is that prisons, whether youth or adult, depend on two things, invisibility and dehumanization, which of course is a form of invisibility. Let's put it this way. Have you ever seen a youth prison?
No.
That's the right answer. And it's not a trick question. That's because we don't put them where the public is likely to see them. We site them in remote rural areas. And one reason for that is, that they function as job engines for rural communities. But it's important that they be in places where we can't see them. And even if we make it a point of trying to see them, as a reporter, I can't just walk into a youth prison. It's a taxpayer-funded institution, but that doesn't mean that the public has any right to see what's going on inside them. It's generally completely at the discretion of the warden or whoever's running the place. Family members who go to visit their kids, there's all kinds of obstacles to that. But even when they surmount those obstacles, they see them in a visiting room. So they don't get to go onto the units where young people live. Um, And it's really hard to mobilize people to change something that they can't see. And that's why I talk a lot in the book about the work of young people themselves, in whether they're smuggling letters out of lockdown units, as some kids in California did, or coming out of these places and testifying about what they experienced. Parent activism was incredibly important because parents were also able to say, this is what was done to my son, but also this is who my son is. He's not an inmate, he's not a convict, he's a child and he's my child. So I think the work of breaking through invisibility and the work of countering what's really a racialized dehumanization go hand in hand.
And in the book, former youth prisoners, still youths, I think, in many cases, who were able to testify in person along with their families, were the next best thing to being there in person or having video. These were people in the flesh and blood with their faces telling their first person accounts. This was a very, still is, I assume, a very powerful part of how people are moved on this, right?
Yeah, and again, I think this speaks to the second half of the equation, which is dehumanization. I sort of got to know young people who were sent to these places in the early 1990s when I was editing a youth newspaper in San Francisco. And we had kids from all over the Bay Area, every kind of background. And this was the height of the super predator mania. I don't know, I'm guessing you remember it. But a Princeton sociologist had kind of spliced speculative demographics together with these ancient racial stereotypes and claimed he had hard evidence that we were about to experience a wave of remorseless criminals, no sense of family, no sense of other humans. And this was on the cover of every single news magazine. And the image was always a young Black man. So, and it really affected the young people I was working with. Sometimes when I would walk down the street with one of my writers who was Black, I would have people ask me if I was okay. Did I need help? Um, One of my writers started wearing a t-shirt because our office was in the financial district that said, "No, white lady, I don't want your purse." And now when I share that, people laugh. Nobody laughed then. You could see people visibly relax. They took him at his word. So yeah, it was essential that young people tell their stories, speak for themselves, and it's horrific that we demand that children make the case for their own humanity, but they did, and that was an essential part of this movement.
And I think to some extent, at least some section of this society and some others around the world have been making progress in recent decades, both on young people being humans and on people of other races and ethnicities being humans, right? There has been some progress.
We could spend the rest of the hour talking about where we're at on that one, right? There has been some progress. There's also some significant backsliding, to put it mildly.
So you don't think general progress on that has a lot to do with the success of shutting down youth prisons?
No, and that's not an opinion. Because as the number of kids incarcerated has shrunk, the proportion who are Black has risen. So 20 years ago, I think a Black kid was 7 times more likely than a white kid who had done something similar to be incarcerated. Now it's more like 9 or 10 times more likely. So
Yeah.
it's not a vibe. It just becomes clearer and clearer that these institutions were set up for and remain reserved for almost entirely Black and brown kids.
Okay, that's discouraging. Another point I thought I found in the book was that the good people working on this, like yourself, really had to be in it for the long run because every reform, well intentioned or misguided, had to be tried and fail first before you could get rid of the thing.
Yes.
You couldn't end it, not mend it. You had to mend it in every possible way first, and then say, okay, we're going to end it.
And there's an irony there. My previous book is called Burning Down the House, and it's a reported account of what happens inside these places and who the children that we incarcerate are. And there's a chapter towards the end that I think I called the real recidivism problem, because it's not the kids who are recidivists, it's the institutions. I mean, these places have been sued, they've signed consent decrees, they've been investigated, they've been condemned. They've been subject to media exposés. They promise and promise and promise to reform, and they don't. And so we talk about recidivism as a problem of the individual and not the institution.
But it's the prisons that are the
There
recidivists.
is no greater recidivist. Yeah.
You did a great job 12 years ago on my radio show about that book, by the way.
Thank
I,
you.
the video is on my website. The other thing I thought I learned from the book was that even though the United States trails, every other country on this issue, it's very hard to get people in a state or a locality in the United States to learn from other countries. But some of them learned quite rapidly from other jurisdictions within the United States when they started uh, making actual reforms, actually getting rid of youth incarceration.
Yeah. And
Other
that's human nature. I think that you're more likely to mimic your neighbor than somebody across the globe. I'm not sure I would say that they learned quickly.
okay,
This really has been a long journey with a lot of zigzagging and ups and downs. But yeah, I do think that when you saw somebody one county over doing things differently or one state over, there were some ripple
yeah,
effects. Sure.
yeah, I think so. So when I travel around the world, people ask questions about the whole world, and in the United States,
You know what? You're right. You're
we never care
actually,
about the United States.
that's such a good point. It might be an American quality to think that we do things our way.
Oh, things that
Uh,
this 4% of humanity does, we excuse as human nature all the time.
yeah.
But there is that other 96%. Um, there also was or still is in this movement in the book a lot of bringing on academics and foundations and researchers and think tanks. Can you talk about the role of those sort of organizations and institutions?
Yeah. I mean, I think of the MacArthur Foundation. I think especially of the Annie E. Casey Foundation. Uh, a guy named Bart Lubau, who's one of my mentors, ran something called the Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative for about 30 years, and they laboriously worked with county probation departments to essentially bring reason to bear on something that wasn't rational. And when JDI consultants first showed up at a county, they often found that the judges and probation chiefs, mucky mucks in that county didn't even know who they were incarcerating. So they would bring consultants in to help them figure out who was locked up for what. For example, in Cook County in Chicago, the late great Barry Crisberg, who was a consultant to them, among many other things, described standing outside cell doors and asking kids one by one what they were locked up for because no records were kept anywhere. So NEAKC would gather the data, show the data to the people, and say, is this rational? You know, let's separate the kids who pose a threat from the kids we're just pissed off at. Um, and they invested money in diversion programs as well as in this data. And a term that Bart uses that I think really describes this movement is incremental abolition. And that's what we talked about earlier of
Yeah.
creating programs and initiatives and policy changes that get a few kids out and then a few more and then a few more. And that's how it really happened anywhere. What the MacArthur Foundation did, which was phenomenal, was they supported a network of developmental psychologists and neuroscientists with the explicit goal of bringing emerging insights about the adolescent brain to bear on juvenile justice and specifically to bear on the practice of charging kids as adults. They were able to show with something called the functional MRI, not only that that adolescent brain was physically different, but that it responded differently to stimuli. Young people brains kind of lit up in term when there was risk to be taken. Their brains reacted differently when they were in a group than when they were on their own. All kinds of stuff that made its way into a series of Supreme Court decisions that did not abolish but limited the practice of trying kids as adults.
Yeah, and things like sentencing kids for life or mandatory sentences of kids for life or of people under a certain age like 21. You see some states doing things like that and citing some of that data as
Yeah. So
why.
and that's there was a lot of anxiety in the advocate community that when we closed youth prisons, we would see larger numbers of kids tried as adults because judges, and by the way, when I say youth prison, I'm talking about the large state-run 100% prison-like institutions. I'm not so much talking about county juvenile halls, so
Yeah.
which is where you go pre-adjudication. Um, so the concern was that when we closed these large prison-like institutions, judges would send more kids to the adult system because they needed a tougher. That's not what happened. The number of kids tried as adults dropped more than 75% over this same period. Unfortunately, that is where we're seeing the backlash in the years since the pandemic. A handful of states have passed laws allowing more and younger kids to be tried as adults. We've got DAs sprinkled around the country who are committing to charging more kids as adults. So I think that's where there really needs to be vigilance and attention right now.
On a whole smorgasbord of issues that Roots Action works on at the state level, having given up on on the federal level more or less. If we lay out a map of which states are making the most progress and which are the furthest behind, most of the maps are the same. In this case, is it the states? Is it the states that I would think it is that are the furthest behind? Is it? Is
Are you
it?
trying not to say red state, blue state?
It,
What do you mean the
I'm
states
not
that you?
trying not to say anything. It's yeah, it's the red. I think it's probably the mostly the reddest states and the former Confederacy and uh, that are on most of these maps. The ones that I'm sort of asking: is there a divide existing or growing between the states that are doing better and the states that aren't on this issue?
Um, so I have a feeling I don't have a clear answer on that. And the reason for that is that what makes criminal and juvenile justice so complicated is that some of it operates at the state level, a lot of it happens at the county level. Uh, so here in Blue, California, where I live, in blue Berkeley, California, we have a district attorney who has overturned her predecessor's. I think she might have just been voted out of office. But we have a bunch of district attorneys around California who have recommitted to trying youth as adults. So
Yeah.
if I had the data in front of me, I could give you a clearer answer.
But it's
But
more fine grained than just the state level. It's the local level too.
right, and the politics of fear, unfortunately, work in every jurisdiction.
So someone asked a question on the topic we
Yeah.
just left that the data on young people's brains not being fully developed until 25 and so forth, is a lot of that generally accepted everywhere, or do people have to, lawyers and parents have to research and prove and argue that a kid is a kid in particular cases?
Yeah, that's a great question. And because of what I just described, because criminal justice is um, so localized, I think the answer is both. So the Supreme Court set a series of precedents in a series of cases, pardon me, that are known as the Miller trilogy. So the first introduction of brain science led to a decision that you couldn't execute children. So it was the most extreme practice that was banned. Then they decided, again, citing this brain research, that you couldn't sentence a child to mandatory life without parole. You could still sentence a child to life without parole, but it couldn't be mandatory. You had to look at the individual circumstances. So they did set these precedents, and Supreme Court precedent trickles down through state courts. One young man I wrote about who had been sentenced as an adult, the precedent changed during his sentence. Um, but there's precedent and there's law, and then there's individual judges. So this one young man that I write about in some depth in Washington State, who was given a long adult sentence, it's like the judge was aware of the brain research, but he completely got it backwards. He said, wish I had the words in front of me, but he said, you were running the streets, you were not under the control of your parents, you had fathered a child. Clearly, you were living the life of an adult. So I look at those things and I think, like, that kid needs to grow up. Jesus Christ. Uh, so it's a both and. Technically, there should be some uniformity to the notion that a child is a child is a child. But because our criminal justice system is a patchwork of local and state and federal laws, I'm not at all surprised to learn, Julie, that someone you heard about had to bring the research into court himself.
Yeah. Um, there there are a lot of great people in the book, as I recall, that are doing this work, and I was surprised to learn how much some of this was an inside job. How someone had to get themselves running, the
Yeah.
program for a government of youth incarceration in order to shut it down. The way you get a Republican to run the education department or health and human services who don't want it to exist. So you put
What a great analogy. Never thought of that.
the enemy of the department in charge of the department.
Wow, I hate to think we created the prototype for that.
Oh, I'm not suggesting anything of the sort. It just comes to mind as, and like serial abolishers, like a guy who
Vinny
runs the
Schiraldi
department, shuts it down, runs another. Yeah, say their names and talk a
yeah.
little bit about some of these.
Yeah, I mean, I think Vinny Schiraldi certainly qualifies as a serial uh inside job abolitionist. I don't know if he's a total abolitionist. We could have a whole other conversation about that word, but he kind of got things started in Washington, D.C. He got himself hired against all odds to run the Department of Youth Services, I think it was called, um, with the explicit goal of shutting down Oak Hill, which was a horrifically abusive, rat-infested chamber of horrors where DC youth who had been adjudicated delinquent were sent. So he's simultaneously working with a lot of outside activists, garnered the political will to close it, and built an alternative, a place called New Beginnings, that was basically a much kinder, gentler youth prison. Had lawns and classrooms and activities, and the kids could open the windows. It was still a is still a locked facility, but nothing like the dungeon it replaced. And then there's Gladys Carrion in New York State. Um, and you're right about Vinny. He quickly joined her as New York City's probation commissioner and worked with her while she shut down 23 upstate youth prisons as the head of the system. And then I also write about Candace Jones in Illinois, who took the job again with the express intent of freeing young people. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's amazing they got those jobs. And it's amazing what they did. And I hope there'll be another generation.
Um, I hope so too. when you shut down something that's a job provider in a small town or a rural location, that can become a big issue. How dare you take away people's money and jobs?
Right,
To what
correct.
extent does that has that had to be addressed, and how has it been addressed?
I mean, it's a huge political pressure. Candace Jones, who shut down a youth prison in Illinois, uh, told me this incredible story. They have a law there that when you close a prison, you have to hold a hearing, an open hearing, not at the state capitol, and not in her case in Chicago, where almost all of the kids who were incarcerated came from, but in the little town where the place is located. And so she went out to go to this meeting, billboards along the highways saying save IYC Kiwani, which was the place she was trying to close. People screaming at her. It's just kind of the whole town turned it out because the whole town was really a prison town. I think one of the more shocking things that came out of the testimony there was it the superintendent making this heartfelt plea that if they were to close the prison, it would harm children because the guards would have to go work at another facility somewhere else in the state, and their children would be uprooted from their homes, their communities, their friends, everything they knew. It was like the kids who were uprooted from everything they knew to feed this creature just didn't exist. I mean, I think the local muffler guy submitted public testimony saying that he would go out of business if he couldn't fix the cars of the people who were forced to drive hundreds of miles to see their kids. Um, there's different opinions about how to respond to that. Some people whom I respect a lot think we need the equivalent of a plant closing strategy, just retraining the coal miners.
Right.
Uh, I'm 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 not sure anyone has the right to a job keeping someone else's children in cages. And I say that not to demonize the guards, because I don't think that the individual guards are at the heart of the problem, except in some instances. But industries come and go.
I don't know. I don't usually use the language of rights for things like this, but I'd like everybody to be able to have a job, a better job, a non incarcerating job. Like,
Yeah.
have there been any efforts to retrain, retool, help people shift from being prison guards to being something else?
And probably, but mostly what I've heard about is making sure that people can transfer from one institution to another. That doesn't mean what you're describing hasn't happened. And as I said, I know there are people who feel it should happen. Uh, I have not come across an instance of it happening. But the other thing is just because if you close a place down, yeah, people are going to lose their jobs. But in New York, for example, the union was so strong that Gladys had to keep facilities that she had emptied out entirely open for a year before she could close them. So she brought it was Cuomo, the governor, in to see guards kind of mopping the already shining floors of these closed institutions so they could continue to draw their salary for a year.
Yeah.
But I don't know.
A lot of strange hiccups and false starts, but it's not a smooth transition from where we are to ideal public policies. But
Well, honestly, and this is something I've heard anecdotally, so I can't say it with any more certainty than that, but uh, that there are a decent number of former prison guards and former police officers now working for ICE. And I think my more cynical self sometimes thinks that we will be able to sustain the change that we have made on youth incarceration because we have simply found another dark-skinned population to terrorize and incarcerate and make money off of.
Well, there's no question that there's many former military and former police in ICE, and including those who couldn't get rehired in their
Right.
previous job,
Right.
which is a little discouraging because I'm thinking as I'm reading this book that one of the side benefits of employing fewer people in a job that makes them sort of fascistic is that you'll have fewer such people in your society if you're
Absolutely. Yeah, I don't think Elizabeth Gaines from the Osborne Association in New York, who's another person I consider a mentor, uh, sometimes says, no child grows up thinking, when I grow up, I want to cage my brother. Um, but I think that the sort of, and Vinnie Schiraldi talks also about what happens when someone is newly hired into one of these roles and enters a culture where violence and abuse are endemic, that it changes the person. They don't go in with the intention of brutalizing children, but that's the culture, and we are all very good at acculturating.
yeah, so we have to get them out but not get them into ice or something similar, ideally. They're also in this big success story. I think there's also a lot of luck and a lot of outside factors and a lot of good timing, and trends in crime rates and so forth. How much how big a role do you think that is compared to the brilliant strategizing and hard work and passionate advocacy of people?
Are you asking, did this happen because youth crime fell, or did this happen because people advocated?
Yeah, or how much of each?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could untangle that. The only thing I can say is that I don't think that these are two separate trends. And the reason I say that is that one thing we know from a lot of research is that youth incarceration is actively criminogenic. So if you want to take a rebellious teenager and turn that kid into an adult criminal, the most effective intervention is to incarcerate them. That even one night in juvenile hall significantly increases the impact, or I'm sorry, the chance that a kid will grow up to commit crimes as an adult. So I think again, we saw a virtuous cycle. As we dialed back this criminogenic intervention, youth crime dropped. That's not the only factor.
Yeah.
Nobody has been able, as far as I know, to figure out exactly why youth crime dropped so steeply. But here's another thing that is part of the virtuous cycle theory. We talk about crime statistics as if they were mathematical absolutes, but crime statistics are really just arrest and prosecution statistics. So if you stop arresting kids for skipping school, loitering, even shoplifting, a lot of places are diverting shoplifters. If you stop arresting and charging those kids, or if you arrest and divert them, then the crime numbers go down because you're not calling certain things crimes.
And you say the
So
crime rate dropped and everybody thinks people's behavior changed.
and the reverse can be true also. You know, you implement a curfew and start arresting kids for breaking curfew, all of a sudden the crime rate's up, but
Yeah,
nothing has changed.
yeah,
I don't, I think we really don't look at the degree to which youth crime rates in particular, uh, obviously they are related to young people's actions, but they are also very much related to the decisions that adults make.
yeah. And if you cause the crime rate to go down through any combination of factors, including not arresting kids for minor stuff, you get less crime hysteria in the media as well, which is less pressure on elected officials to get tough on crime, right?
Yes, very much so. The problem is that the tough on crime trick, which is to say, you're in tremendous danger, but don't worry, I can save you. It's just terrifically effective. And I think we will always see that kind of politicking. And that's always going to be a countervailing force to things like reason and compassion.
I'm not sure the guy who's in the White House now would be there if it weren't for telling us that Mexicans were
Well,
criminals.
that's not what I was trying to say. Okay, maybe it was.
um, it's on my mind anyway.
No, no, of course that's what I was thinking of. It's effective.
Yeah, it's but then when nothing gets better after the guy's there for years, do you still blame the Mexicans like
Oh,
for
I wish I had the answer to that one. We'll
uh,
find out, right?
yeah. I guess the other thing about virtuous cycles, I think, in movements like this, of people who are working for this positive change, is that when they see some progress, they can imagine more.
Exactly.
I think it's hard not just for politicians, but even for activists to imagine the big full prison going to nothing. You know,
Okay, that's a really important observation, and it takes me to the last two chapters of the book. Originally, I had thought that half of the book would recount this movement to do away with youth incarceration or greatly diminish it, and the second half of the book would look at what individuals and communities and community organizations were doing to do what is supposed to be the job of the juvenile justice system, to create safety, to create accountability, to rehabilitate. And essentially what happened is the first half of the book ate the second half. But I do have two chapters at the end where I look at just the incredible work community organizations are doing to address harm. Because I think we make a real mistake, and it's a mistake I've made, when we talk only about the negative effects of incarceration, but don't acknowledge the harm that crime does, right? Real harms are being committed. And if we're not going to address those harms through incarceration, we need to address them in some other way. Um, and one thing I did when I was reporting the book was I asked a lot of people who had grown up in, what are considered high crime neighborhoods, what do you think would create safety in your neighborhood? And not only did none of them say a prison or the police, they didn't even talk about programs. What they talked about were parks and playgrounds and camping trips and clean water and sports and decent schools, all the stuff that all of us want for our own kids. And like you said, as in some communities they began to build it, then the public could see it. And I think that does shift attitudes. When you see a kid, when you give a kid an opportunity to shine and people can see that, it is very different than what they see when they see a kid in a uniform with a prison number.
yeah. I've had professors on my radio show with books and statistics who have said we know what would reduce violent crime. Is it better lives for people, as you said, and nonviolent interventions and assistance and programs for young people that aren't counterproductive.
Yeah,
It's not that we don't know. It's not that it's a mystery. It's just that we
exactly.
don't actually fully do it, right?
Yes, correct.
Um, we've got 10 minutes left. I wonder where this movement is going now. Is there any sort of snowballing of people being able to bring success stories to the next
Yeah.
fiction?
You've also got a question, and I want to ask the questioner for more. Besides reading my book, where can people go for good material? Um, what kind of material? To learn more about juvenile justice, to learn more about movement building. So I'm just going to throw that out there. Uh, are we going to see a snowball effect? I think we already have seen a snowball effect, um, in exactly the way I described. As we have dialed back these criminogenic interventions, we see less crime. As we see less crime, we feel less need to punish. But again, we're in a moment of backlash, um, where I think we really need to be very vigilant just to preserve the gains that we've made at this point.
And if you
Data that can be used to advocate for change. Okay. Um, a great a great source of um, a great source of data is the Sentencing Project. They are sort of the data kings. The Annie Casey Foundation is also a wonderful repository of data and research on youth incarceration. Those are the two that come to mind. Um, and I'll keep thinking, but that's who comes to mind right off the bat.
And in terms of your work and the Youth Law Center, what are you about now, and what's coming up?
Well, I'm pretty new to the Youth Law Center. Uh, but what I love about our work, which encompasses foster care as well as juvenile justice, is when you think of a sort of a legal advocacy organization, you think of somebody who is just suing to stop the bad things. That's not how we operate. We're simultaneously suing to stop the worst abuses and working with community partners and public systems to create better options and possibilities. Um, Somebody I spoke with this morning, someone on our board described it as sort of the inside cat, outside cat approach. You know, that some people are cut out to scream from the outside and others are cut out to do the work from inside the house, and we do both. And I'm still learning about how effective that is.
Um, I would think it would be very. What would you recommend to someone who's watching, listening, who cares, who thinks it's horrific and outrageous and unacceptable that we're still putting young people in cages? How would you recommend that people go about getting involved?
I mean, there's a lot of issues right now on which to base one's vote. But when I'm voting in local elections, this is a bit of a litmus test for me. You know, I won't vote for a DA who is going to try kids as adults. Uh, I look at what my local board of supervisors is doing and saying about it. I think most of this, very, very little criminal and juvenile justice policy is set at the federal level. So I think that gives the individual citizen a lot of leverage to vote and be active in local politics and make this your issue.
Yeah, that may be one of the keys to success is to take on an issue that you can impact through local politics, which is
That's
still
My July 4th message. Yeah.
yes, very good. It's 250th celebration there. Uh, Good advice. I I've asked a lot of questions. Is there anything I should have asked and haven't?
You know, I've been thinking a lot about how this book might speak to people for whom youth justice is not the most important thing. Uh, and I think we are at a moment when a lot of people feel sort of helpless, feel are afraid of being crushed in the gears of an authoritarian system. And I do think the book speaks to them because the young people and the parent activists I write about, none of this was hypothetical to them. They were literally being crushed in the gears of an authoritarian system that had near total control over them. And still they resisted, and still they persisted, and still they spoke out at great personal risk. And really, I think, are the heart of this movement and made change. So I think there is a message for this larger moment in their story.
I think it's a wonderful message, and it's a terrific book that I hope people watching this video who didn't read the book already will get it and read it. It's called In Our Future, We Are Free. And I hope that is completely true in the
Oh,
near future,
yeah.
um, that we are all free in every way. Uh, Nell Bernstein, it's a wonderful book and wonderful conversation. And thank you for everything you've been doing and for coming on this book club.
Thank you. It's really been a pleasure. I'm glad I made it.
I'm glad you made it too. Thanks so
Okay.
much. Thanks to
Thank you.
everyone. Good night.
Thanks.